afternoon and thank you for joining us on FutureTV. I'm Linda Tamim and these are today's top stories. A suicide bomber kills at least 3 people, including 2 Hezbollah members, and wounds 11 others in East Lebanon. Syrian regime forces ready an assault on the last rebel-held areas in the Kalamoun Mountains after overrunning the key opposition bastion of Yabrud. And Crimea's Regional Assembly declares independence from Ukraine and applies to join Russia. A suicide bomber has killed at least 3 people, including 2 Hezbollah members, and wounded 11 others in the East Lebanon village of Nabi Othman last night, in what was interpreted as a direct response to the group's joint military campaign in the Syrian city of Yabrud. The suicide attack came as the Syrian army launched several airstrikes around the border town of Arsal, hours after gaining control of Yabrud, as fears mounted that the flocking of Syrian fighters to the town will expose it to more security incidents. Sources say the bomber detonated a dark green Grand Cherokee rigged with 120 kilograms of explosives, right as Hezbollah's security personnel identified as Abderrahim al-Qadi and Khalil Khalil intercepted the car and tried to block its path. Both men died in the explosion. The Lebanese army blew up a booby-trapped vehicle found on the Fakhr Ras Baalbek road in eastern Lebanon after firing a B-7 rocket on it. The army says the car contained 170 kilograms of explosives. It launched an investigation to identify the suspects involved in the plot to blow up the vehicle. A group calling itself the Baalbek Ahrar al-Sunnah Brigade and the Nusra Front in Lebanon made separate claims of responsibility for the bombing. Officials are scrambling to avert a crisis over the cabinet's policy statement following a threat by the Kataib party to withdraw its ministers unless a clause on the state's authority in defending Lebanon is amended. Maronite Patriarch Bashar al-Ra'i voiced support for the Kataib stance, urging government officials to resolve the ambiguity in the policy statement over the state's role in defending Lebanon. 3 Kataib ministers have voiced reservations over a clause in the policy statement that fails to put Hezbollah's armed resistance against Israeli occupation under state authority, as demanded by the March 14 coalition. Syrian regime forces are readying an assault on the last rebel-held areas in the Kalamoun Mountains, strategically located on the Lebanese border, after overrunning key opposition bastion Yabrud. The capture on Sunday of Yabrud by Syrian troops and fighters of Lebanon's Hezbollah marked a significant setback for the rebels, as it severs their important supply lines from across the Lebanese border. Yabrud is a strategic prize because of its proximity to the highway and the Lebanese border, across which the rebels have smuggled fighters and weapons. Moving on to Europe, Crimea's Regional Assembly has declared independence from Ukraine and applied to join Russia, saying all Ukrainian state property on the peninsula will be nationalized. In Kiev, Ukraine's parliament approved the partial mobilization of troops to counter Russian interference in the country, a day after Crimea voted to secede from Kiev and join Russia. A majority of deputies approved the motion, citing the worsening political situation in the country and Russia's interference in Ukraine's internal affairs. Meanwhile, British Foreign Secretary William Hague says he is confident that the European Union will ratchet up pressure on Russia over its role in the breakaway by imposing sanctions on people linked to the secession of the peninsula. And coming up next, Nadim Houdi from Human Rights Watch talks domestic abuse and Tripoli violence. Stay with us. Welcome back, and now we continue with an exclusive interview by our very own Yumna Naufal. Over to you, Yumna.
Thank you, Linda. Today we're talking about the story of 3 women who lost their lives to domestic violence, and this has made headlines and sparked anger throughout the country, and it led to more than 2,000 men and women marching in a demonstration organized by Kafa, translated into Enough, on March 8th, which is also International Women's Day. Now, a draft law for domestic violence was first submitted to Parliament back in 2010. But there were amendments, and they were finalized in August of 2012. They altered the title of the text, which now refers to violence against the family as opposed to women specifically. And we have Human Rights Watch Deputy Director of the MENA region today, Nadim Houdi, with us to answer some of our questions. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Why the change from family to women?
There were actually a number of changes. The title, but also in the content, because our parliamentarians wanted to weaken some of these provisions. There was the sense that by making it about the family, as opposed to really calling what the main problem is here, which is violence against women, they'll make it more amenable to the religious authorities, and they'll somehow make it more acceptable. But the fact is, what is needed today in Lebanon is a strong law, but also needs strong enforcement from state institutions. And we have to stop being cute about it and trying to hide it and try to weaken it, because women are dying. And according to some statistics, one Lebanese woman is dying every month because of domestic violence, dying. And that doesn't include the countless numbers that are being, beaten.
Now, has domestic violence always been a public issue, or are we just hearing about it now because these cases have been, I think there were 3 cases in the last 4 months alone, and they finally had light in the media?
Look, the issue has always existed in Lebanon like it does in all other countries, but for a long time it was considered a taboo, a private subject. No one really wanted to talk about it. Finally, after years of work by civil society, mostly led by local efforts, by groups like CAFA and others, the issue is now on the public agenda. And I think this is a very important work that they've done. We now have to see it to completion. And this is the real challenge today.
I know there was also a lot of backlash because the committee also removed a key clause criminalizing marital rape after religious figures and politicians said that, no, marital rape should be allowed.
Right.
What about that?
That's the problem, I mean, how can you say, first of all, for many religious clerics, there is no such thing as marital rape. A husband has a right to his wife, even if she doesn't want to. And frankly, that is just absurd. I mean, a woman has the right to say no, even to her husband. And the challenge today, frankly, for the Lebanese parliament, is to stand up to the religious clerics and to say, look, when it comes to promoting equality of men and women, we're talking about equality between Lebanese citizens. It is the Lebanese parliament and the Lebanese judiciary that is ultimately responsible. And that means criminalizing marital rape and treating it like any other rape.
And this probably explains, the religious figures and politicians probably explain, does it explain at all why the men, or at least I know of one case where the man who killed his wife went out on bail. He was released soon after. I mean, this was murder.
So I think there are 2 things here. For a long time, there were provisions in our penal code that basically, said things like honor crimes are dealt with less seriously than regular crime. A murder, because if it's done under the guise of honor, the person will get a reduced sentence or get treated with leniency. Some of these provisions have been amended, but that spirit still exists in many cases and in some texts. And that's a problem. And there's also a second problem, the idea of, wasta. These men are using some of their links, so while the investigation is pending, they are out. But what we need here is ultimately convictions based on evidence. And that is the more troubling aspect. In one of the cases, for example, where the husband, a wife died after being beaten by the husband, they botched up the forensic exam, and now they're saying there's no evidence that a woman who was actually perfectly healthy and in her 30s, why she died. Again, I mean, this is a case of not bad laws, but actually bad implementation and a lack of seriousness by law enforcement and by the judiciary in Lebanon.
When you speaking of law enforcement and the judiciary, another issue that is making headlines in Lebanon is Tripoli, which is witnessing clashes on a daily basis. I know Human Rights Watch is conducting a lot of studies on it. There's been a report released at the beginning of this year because the clashes are on a weekly basis between the rival neighborhoods of Jabal al-Muhsin, Beit Tabeni. Since Thursday alone, the death toll hit 11, and there have been more than 60 wounded. So what can they do about Tripoli? There are gunmen, as we were talking about this earlier, just running around freely. And you were mentioning education, which I want to talk about right now.
Sure. I mean, frankly, part of the problem in the Tripoli story has been that the politicians and the media only focus on the gunmen. They tend to forget that there are civilians on both sides of the divide, and these civilians are suffering. I mean, we're now talking about 19 rounds of violence in the last few years. And it's not just gunmen shooting at each other. Every time gunmen shoot at each other, there are children that are unable to go to school. There are women who can't go to hospitals. There are actually people who can't make it to their workplace because of the danger on the road because of snipers and others. And the Lebanese state has a responsibility to protect these civilians and to go after the gunmen. Everyone tells us, it's complicated, it's political. Everything in Lebanon, unfortunately, is political. Violence has been political for the last 30 years.
Do you think it's because Tripoli is not a priority right now with the Syrian spillover, maybe the refugees?
It hasn't been a priority for a very long time. It isn't a priority now. It hasn't been a priority for many years.
So what's the solution to Tripoli?
Well, it's very clear. One, you have to, you need a security solution in the sense that the gunmen cannot rule the streets again. Lebanon is not in a state of civil war. The Lebanese state has to affirm itself. It has to take the weapons away from these gunmen. But a security solution alone will not suffice. It has to be complemented. There has to be a real investment by the state in that area. When we look at the statistics for areas like Jabal Muhsin and Bab al-Tabani, has the highest dropout rate in schools across the country. That's not just a failure of education. That means that you're creating a reservoir of young, unemployed teenagers who are easy prey for men with guns, and they give them for a couple $100 a month, can get them to carry weapons. 3, you have a health problem. You have a jobs problem. I mean, this is Lebanon's second city that has been neglected now for many years by successive administrations in Lebanon. And we are just setting ourselves up for more and more violence. If you look at these frequency of violence, they're becoming more frequent. The time between one round and the other has become shorter and shorter. And the intensity of the violence and the weapons that we're seeing are becoming as well more intense.
The state is aware of this, obviously, and the government is aware. Tripoli is making headlines every day in the news. What can they do? I mean, what would be the first step? You're talking education, you're talking making sure that they remove the arms from the gunmen. The army's not doing much, obviously.
Well, the army, when we go to Tripoli, I mean, the army and the ISF, they know the gunmen, and they know the leaders of these gunmen. They're just not able to go after them, and that's the challenge. I mean, some of the checkpoints are referred to
for
as
political reasons. They're not able to go after them, or
I suspect so. They don't think they have political cover, but ultimately, frankly, this idea in Lebanon that security has to have a political cover, we have to get out of it. The state and the state security institutions have to be able to implement the laws against everyone. I mean, the army has been trying in the last few months to arrest some people. They have come under fire, and they've actually been soldiers that have been killed and wounded in the process. But what we're saying is even more has to be done. The judiciary has to take this very seriously. We're not in a state of emergency in Lebanon. So any person that is carrying a gun without a license is technically committing a a crime. How many men in Tripoli have been, prosecuted for carrying unlicensed weapons?
None, almost.
Exactly.
Okay.
There have been no investigations about who is sending these weapons. We're talking about some of the poorest neighborhoods in the entire country. And yet in one round of fighting, according to some economists I spoke to, they estimate between $1 to $2 million worth of rounds of weapons and shells are being used. Clearly, someone is giving that money. So Lebanon is not a big country. Can you not investigate the sources of this money? I mean, there are a lot of allegations in the media, but what we need is a proper judicial investigation to get to the bottom of this.
All right, so this is how, and looking into 2014, I'm guessing with the Syrian spillover, you're expecting even worse numbers to come.
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, we're seeing more. The sectarian problem existed in Tripoli before. When we talk about Jabal Muhsin, Bab al-Tabani, this goes back to the 1970s. There was a massacre in the 1980s. There has never been any process of transitional justice, of working on memory. When you go talk to people up there, history weighs on them. There are historical hatreds that need to be dealt with in a transitional justice way so that people feel their voices are being heard. Those that need to be prosecuted are prosecuted. If not, I'm actually very worried that we'll see more and more rounds of violence this year.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for that information. That was the Human Rights Watch Deputy Director of the MENA region, Mr. Nadim Houri, talking to us about the violence in the country. Back to you, Linda.
Server top stories. A suicide bomber kills at least 3 people, including 2 Hezbollah members, and wounds 11 others in East Lebanon. Syrian regime forces ready an assault on the last rebel-held areas in the Kalamoun Mountains after overrunning the key opposition bastion of Yabrud. And Crimea's Regional Assembly declares independence from Ukraine and applies to join Russia. Those are today's top stories from us here at Future Television. Make sure you tune in again tomorrow for more updates. Take care.